The storm around Daystar has reached a boiling point, and Joni Lamb has finally spoken out. After months of whispers, rumors, and unanswered questions, her words cut through the silence, revealing truths no one expected. Fans, insiders, and even longtime supporters are left reeling as Joni addresses the tensions, family conflicts, and leadership struggles that have shaken the ministry to its core. What she shares isn't just surprising, it's a revelation that changes everything. Joni Lamb has always been seen as a bold, confident figure at the helm of Daystar TV, a woman unafraid to speak her mind and defend her beliefs. For decades, viewers admired her as a strong spiritual leader, someone who could stand tall under the bright lights of Christian television. But recently, that image has begun to shift, and for many, the change has been shocking. It all started when Joni addressed the growing controversies on her show Table Talk. On the surface, the discussion seemed ordinary: cancel culture, gossip, and the dangers of slander in modern society. Yet, for those paying close attention, it felt different. The conversation wasn't just about societal issues. It felt like a carefully crafted response to mounting criticism, a way to control the narrative while avoiding direct answers. During the episode, Joni and her co-hosts warned viewers not to judge others and to focus on prayer rather than confrontation. Some saw this as sound spiritual advice. Others, however, saw a clever deflection. Critics argued that the real issues, allegations surrounding her leadership, questions about accountability, and internal conflicts at Daystar were being ignored. Repeated phrases like, "God told me not to engage with the criticism," only fueled the perception that Joni was hiding behind faith to avoid answering tough questions. For many longtime supporters, the boldness they once admired now felt like a shield, a way to silence uncomfortable conversations instead of facing them. As viewers dissected her words, tensions grew. What had once been a network celebrated for transparency and spiritual guidance now seemed to be prioritizing image over integrity. Instead of providing clear, direct answers, the responses leaned heavily on spiritual language, emotional storytelling, and vague calls for unity and grace. While these messages might comfort some, they left others frustrated and skeptical, questioning whether Daystar's leadership could truly be trusted. Joni's public response, while calm and poised, highlighted the delicate balance of leading a large ministry in the digital age. Every word is analyzed, every gesture scrutinized. In this case, what was meant to inspire faith and encourage prayer became a flashpoint, a symbol of the challenges that arise when leadership, spirituality, and public perception collide. People were watching, listening, and expecting real accountability, and many began to wonder if that was still possible at Daystar under Joni Lamb's guidance. The story of Daystar, a network long seen as a beacon of faith and inspiration, took a dark and deeply personal turn when the Lamb family became embroiled in a scandal that shook both the Christian community and the hearts of those who had trusted them for decades. What appeared on the surface as whispers and rumors soon spiraled into full-blown accusations that threatened to unravel the very foundation of the network. And at the center of it all was the family itself, making the pain not just public, but intimately personal. For years, Daystar had presented an image of unity, strength, and unwavering faith, led by Joni Lamb and her late husband, Marcus Lamb. Their lives seemed intertwined with ministry, service, and leadership. But behind the cameras and the stages, cracks were forming. Cracks that would widen into chasms when Joni's son Jonathan Lamb and his wife Susie stepped forward with an allegation so grave it shook viewers to their core. They claimed that their young daughter had been sexually abused by a family member publicly identified as Pete. The revelation was devastating. For any parent, the thought of a child harmed is an unbearable nightmare. But the horror of what Jonathan and Susie described was compounded by the response they received from their own family and the leadership of the network. Instead of immediate support and protection for the child, Jonathan said that he and Susie were urged to remain silent, pressured to protect the family's public image, and even asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement. The expectation, they said, was to prioritize the reputation of Daystar over the well-being of the child. It was a moment that exposed the painful tension between faith, family loyalty, and leadership. In The Media's Lies, This Is the Revolution, Jonathan refused to sign the agreement, understanding that silence would be complicity, but this decision only fueled the division. Not long after, he was reportedly let go from his position at Daystar, a move the network attributed to performance issues. The conflicting narratives left both supporters and critics questioning the integrity of the family and the organization. While the network maintained that all protocols had been followed and no wrongdoing had occurred, the public perception was far more complicated and, for many, troubling. The legal side of the story added layers of complexity and frustration. Law enforcement reopened the case to investigate the allegations. However, in 2025, the case was closed due to insufficient evidence. While the lack of charges might seem like closure to some, anyone familiar with child abuse cases understands that a legal outcome is not always synonymous with truth or justice. Survivors and their families can remain deeply scarred, while the absence of a conviction leaves lingering questions about accountability. To the wider Christian community and to viewers of Daystar, the case highlighted the difficult and often uncomfortable intersection of faith, family, and institutional responsibility. The scandal also had a corrosive effect on family relationships. Jonathan and Susie felt abandoned, claiming betrayal by the very family members who were supposed to protect them. Joni and other members of the Lamb family, in contrast, insisted that they acted appropriately and with the best intentions. The result was a fracture that went far beyond disagreement over management decisions or public messaging. It was a schism of trust, love, and shared history, one that demonstrated how fragile even the closest family bonds can be when complicated by allegations of abuse and the pressure to maintain a public image. Public reaction was immediate and intense. Viewers, donors, and faith leaders alike expressed shock and concern. Questions arose not only about the alleged abuse itself, but about how Daystar, as a Christian organization, handled the allegations. Critics and former supporters asked why the network did not provide a clear, transparent timeline or allow for external oversight. They worried that a network built on spiritual principles was prioritizing image over truth. Christian leaders, sensitive to the optics and implications, began distancing themselves from Daystar. Some pulled programming or appearances, signaling unease with the way the network was navigating the controversy. It became clear that the crisis was more than a family matter. It was a public reckoning on the ethical responsibilities of Christian organizations when faced with internal allegations of abuse. At the heart of the controversy was the way Daystar and Joni Lamb responded publicly. Instead of clear communication, the network leaned heavily on spiritual language, emphasizing grace, unity, and forgiveness, framing critics and questions as attacks or gossip. On Joni's widely watched show, Table Talk, phrases like, "God told me not to engage with the criticism," and repeated references to cancel culture were used to explain why the network would not confront allegations head-on. While faith and spiritual guidance are central to any ministry, in this context, many saw these statements as a deflection, a way to avoid addressing the seriousness of the claims, and a strategy that left victims and observers feeling silenced. The reliance on spiritual language to navigate this crisis sparked intense debate about accountability in Christian leadership. Many critics argued that it was one thing to focus on prayer and discernment, but quite another to use Scripture to shut down legitimate concerns or avoid transparency. True spiritual leadership, they contended, requires courage to face uncomfortable truths, willingness to be corrected, and the humility to acknowledge mistakes. Using spiritual authority as a shield, they argued, does a disservice not only to victims, but to the wider faith community, undermining trust in religious institutions and in leaders who are expected to model integrity and compassion. The consequences of the family scandal were far-reaching. Trust in Daystar's leadership was eroded. Donors who had contributed, believing their money would support ministry work, now questioned whether funds were being managed responsibly. The network's reputation, painstakingly built over decades, was now under scrutiny. Viewers were forced to confront a dissonance between the image of a family-led Christian network and the reality of internal disputes, mishandled allegations, and the ethical dilemmas surrounding loyalty versus accountability. The human dimension of the scandal remained painfully vivid. Beyond the headlines and legal complexities, there was a child whose trauma became unavoidable, a son and daughter-in-law who felt betrayed by their own family, and a mother and network leader navigating a storm of public scrutiny, grief, and personal responsibility. Every statement, every show, every public comment had the potential to either heal or inflame the situation. And while the network tried to assert spiritual authority, the underlying wounds were very real, psychological, relational, and moral. The story was messy, deeply emotional, and far from resolved, illustrating how abuse allegations within a family and ministry can ripple outward, affecting not just those directly involved, but the community at large. Ultimately, the Daystar scandal exposed a tension that many Christian organizations face: the collision of faith, family, and public responsibility. It highlighted how easily spiritual language can be misused, how difficult it can be to balance protecting a reputation with protecting vulnerable individuals, and how painfully human even the most public figures remain. For the Lamb family, it was a crisis of identity, faith, and moral accountability. For the public, it was a sobering reminder that behind every polished broadcast and uplifting sermon, there are human lives, frailties, and consequences that demand honesty, transparency, and courage. In the end, the scandal left lasting questions about leadership, the proper handling of abuse allegations, and the ethical obligations of those entrusted with both spiritual and institutional authority, proving that no amount of faith or fame can shield a family from the painful realities of human failure. The controversy surrounding Daystar didn't stop with family scandals and allegations of abuse. It extended deep into the financial and ethical heart of the ministry. For decades, Daystar had been seen as a spiritual beacon, a network where millions of viewers tuned in not just for programming, but for hope, guidance, and inspiration. People sent in donations expecting their money to support ministry work, outreach programs, and spreading a message of faith. What they didn't expect was that some of that money might be spent in ways that blurred the line between personal luxury and organizational responsibility. The first whispers began quietly. Observers noticed that Daystar leaders, especially Joni Lamb after the death of her husband Marcus, seemed to live a lifestyle far removed from the average donor. Large estates, private jets, and an array of luxury cars were not necessarily illegal, but the optics of such wealth, funded largely by public donations, raised eyebrows. Questions began to surface when reports emerged about personal expenses being charged to the ministry. One of the most talked about examples was Joni's honeymoon with her new husband, Dr. Doug Weiss. According to reports, roughly $100,000, 0 cents, was charged to a Daystar credit card. The explanation provided was that it was a gift from a board member. Technically permissible, but for donors watching from home, it felt wrong. People wondered how their contributions, sometimes modest, were being used. The emotional disconnect was sharp. A single mother tithing $25, 0 cents a month felt a sting when hearing that such large sums were directed toward luxury experiences rather than outreach. This was compounded by reports about Joni's compensation. After Marcus's passing, her salary reportedly increased significantly. Again, not illegal by any measure. Leaders of large organizations are often well compensated, but the timing and scale caused unease. Critics questioned whether Daystar was being run as a ministry or a business empire. Were family members, all occupying key leadership roles, making financial decisions in the best interests of the mission, or simply protecting their own comfort and status? Without independent oversight, the concern was valid. Transparency wasn't just a moral expectation. It was a necessity for a network funded by public trust. The issue went beyond optics. When the board approved these expenses, some argued, it demonstrated a troubling culture. Decisions that impacted millions of viewers and donors were being made in-house, often by those too close to the Lamb family to maintain objectivity. There was no public accounting, no external audit made readily available, and no clear explanation of how the board balanced personal loyalty with organizational responsibility. Critics saw this as a microcosm of a larger problem: the concentration of power and influence in a family-run ministry without proper checks and balances. Even the most loyal supporters began asking uncomfortable questions. Who really watches the ministry? Who ensures money is spent ethically? And when leaders blur personal and professional boundaries, who holds them accountable? The timing of these revelations made matters worse. Coming on the heels of the family scandal and abuse allegations, donors and viewers felt a pattern emerging. If Daystar could allegedly mishandle or suppress serious abuse claims, could it also be mismanaging finances? Was the deflection of criticism through spiritual language and public messaging just as present in financial decisions as in personal scandals? For some, the network's reputation shifted overnight. Daystar had long been seen as trustworthy, a safe harbor for faith in an uncertain world. But now the questions about integrity and stewardship were front and center. The network's response to financial concerns only inflamed skepticism. Instead of clear, open communication, the explanations were often couched in spiritual language. Statements about God's provision or the generosity of donors and board members were repeated, but specific accounting details remained elusive. Journalists and watchdogs struggled to get transparent answers. Board members insisted that all decisions were above board and in accordance with internal policies, yet there were no publicly verified audits. This created a perception, if not proof, that accountability was being avoided. Donors, accustomed to trusting the network, began feeling unease. The spiritual rhetoric meant to comfort now felt like a shield between the substance. The purpose of the service was crashed, and some circumstances of sin seemed visible, did not seem sufficiently evident. Ethics became the central question. Daystar is not just a private company. It is a faith-based nonprofit, operating under the public trust. People expect spiritual leaders to model transparency, stewardship, and integrity. Even when no laws are broken, decisions that appear self-serving erode trust. Many observers argue that ethical responsibility in such organizations isn't optional. It's intrinsic. A ministry cannot hide behind legality. It must demonstrate moral clarity and accountability. The more the network leaned into spiritual deflection, the more donors and the public questioned whether personal gain had begun to overshadow public mission. The consequences were significant. Criticism spread beyond social media, reaching other ministries and networks. Some Christian leaders withdrew their support, canceled programming deals, or made public statements emphasizing the importance of transparency and stewardship. Donors began reconsidering contributions, not out of malice, but from a sense of betrayal. Those who had once trusted Daystar unconditionally now felt compelled to scrutinize every financial decision. For many, it became a moral dilemma, supporting a network that had inspired them spiritually while questioning whether that network was truly living by the principles it preached. In addition, the internal culture came under the microscope. Staff members reported tension and uncertainty about financial priorities and decision-making. With family members holding multiple key positions, there was concern that dissenting voices might be silenced or ignored. Ethical questions such as appropriate use of donor funds, adequate documentation, and the separation of personal and professional expenses became constant discussion points behind the scenes. Even loyal employees and supporters faced difficult questions about how to reconcile their faith in the ministry with the ethical ambiguities surrounding its leadership. This environment created a larger ripple effect, raising questions about Christian nonprofits broadly. Daystar had been a flagship example of success and influence. Now, it became a cautionary tale of how concentrated power, lack of external oversight, and blurred boundaries between personal and organizational finances can erode even the most trusted institutions. Donors, viewers, and critics alike began discussing the need for independent audits, transparent reporting, and a clear system of checks and balances. Essentially, the kind of governance that ensures that money donated in faith is used in alignment with the mission, not to serve private luxury. Through it all, Joni Lamb and Daystar faced a dilemma. Every public statement, every show, every message had to balance spiritual authority, public perception, and the moral obligation to uphold integrity. While some of her explanations resonated with viewers seeking faith-centered answers, others saw them as evasive. The financial questions, combined with the prior family scandal, created a complex narrative, one where the appearance of ethical lapses, even in the absence of legal wrongdoing, risked undoing decades of trust and goodwill. Our table refers to the finances of partly complex death with Reverend R. The Daystar financial controversy ultimately highlighted the intersection of money, power, and faith. It demonstrated how even well-intentioned leaders can face ethical dilemmas when wealth, family influence, and public trust collide. Donors realized that their faith extended beyond supporting programs itself. It included expecting honesty, accountability, and stewardship from those who received their gifts. Critics argued that transparency is not optional, but a moral imperative for ministries that claim to live by the teachings they broadcast. As the story unfolded, the central lesson became clear. Faith without accountability is fragile, and spiritual leadership cannot substitute for ethical responsibility. Daystar's reputation, built over decades, now rested on its ability to rebuild trust, implement transparent financial practices, and address the ethical concerns that had shaken its audience. For supporters, the hope was that the network would embrace rigorous oversight, openly reconcile past missteps, and demonstrate that ethical stewardship is not just a legal requirement, it is the very essence of moral leadership. Whether Daystar succeeds in this endeavor remains uncertain, but the lessons about integrity, trust, and the responsible management of public contributions are indelible, echoing far beyond the walls of the network itself. The controversy surrounding Daystar didn't just revolve around family drama or financial questions. It reached deep into the very language the ministry used to communicate with the public. For decades, viewers had trusted Daystar not only because of its programming, but because of the way its leaders spoke. Spiritual language, scripture, and faith-based messages were the network's trademark. People tuned in expecting guidance, comfort, and clarity. But what happens when that same language becomes a shield, a way to avoid hard questions rather than address them? That's exactly what critics began to notice during the unfolding controversy. It started subtly. On episodes of Table Talk, Joni Lamb and her co-hosts discussed cancel culture, gossip, and criticism. On the surface, it seemed like a standard discussion about modern challenges in the church. But as viewers watched, it became apparent that the conversation was often less about exploring these issues and more about reframing criticism as spiritual attack. Phrases like, "God told me not to engage with the negativity," were repeated, and while faithful words can bring comfort, in this context, they felt defensive. To some viewers, it looked as if spiritual authority was being wielded to silence dissent rather than to guide.